The Switch 2, I think, is the beginning of an end of an era of Nintendo hate. Specifically, the idea that third party games do not do well on Nintendo platforms, because anyone who's been paying any attention whatsoever has seen firsthand at how consistently well games like Hogwarts Legacy, like Street Fighter 6, and Silksong have done on Nintendo Switch 2. There have been a lot of cases of third-party games finding major success on the platform already, and that is only going to become more apparent as time goes on. The interesting thing about this, however, is that this was reported to not be the case initially. There were a lot of gaming YouTubers who pushed this idea that third-party games weren't selling well on Switch 2, that they were failing, that nobody played games on it, and this was obviously right from the get-go completely ridiculous for any. you know, it was kind of building off of decades of nonsense we as Nintendo fans have had to deal with over the past several years. And that is the third party developers, because very consistently, when it comes to Nintendo releases, third parties have failed to show up. And they always come up with some kind of excuse like Nintendo doesn't suit their demographic, the console sale doesn't sell enough, like it's not worth our development resources. And yet somehow they're willing to put, like, Resident Evil 4 on a Zebo. Okay. The reality is quite a bit different. Like, it is not that difficult or expensive to port a game to another platform. The refusal to put major third party releases on Nintendo consoles in a timely fashion is nothing more than deliberate sabotage. It always has been. It is just a method of trying to steer gamers onto the real gaming platforms, Xbox and PlayStation, while ignoring Nintendo. Now, back in the 90s, this strategy worked because third parties were pumping out amazing games all the time. It was well worth your time to own a PlayStation and a Nintendo console. And it seemed as if third parties were going to kind of overwhelm the industry and become these like titans, like the people who defined where gaming was going forward, up until 2013 or so, where it kind of reached its apex with Grand Theft Auto 5, which, by the way, still has not received any kind of re-release on Nintendo platforms. So with Grand Theft Auto 5, after that release, third parties really did think they had beaten Nintendo. They really thought that Nintendo was going to be driven out of business, that the Wii U would flop, and that they wouldn't be able to continue thriving in this ecosystem. But what ended up happening over the next decade was very interesting. That games started declining in quality, because of wokeness, because of the declining standards in the industry, because of like the real talent being pushed out. Good games increasingly became few and far between, and a lot of them took years and years and years to produce. On average, I would say it takes about like 8 years to produce a good, well-received AAA game, nowhere near the pace it was in the 90s. So what this results in really is that third parties are spending years and years and years and years to produce one game that's supposed to destroy Nintendo, that's supposed to like not go to Nintendo platforms, that's supposed to be PlayStation and Xbox exclusive, that's supposed to drive console sales for the other platforms, whether it's like Final Fantasy 16 or like Final Fantasy 7 Remake or like Silent Hill F or whatever. Companies are throwing their biggest and best IPs at PlayStation and Xbox, and they're starting to see dwindling returns. Like, people aren't as invested in Street Fighter or the like as they were in the 90s. People like me were perfectly willing to wait 2 or 3 years for Street Fighter 6 to launch on Switch 2. And that is the core issue that companies are seeing now, is that people aren't willing to go out and buy a PlayStation or an Xbox for one game that's simply going to come to a Nintendo console in the future. When I became interested in Street Fighter 6, I could have bought it on PC, but I made the deliberate decision to simply just wait until they ported it over, and that was absolutely the right decision on my part. And I think I'm not alone in this. Games take so long to come out now that the age-old cope that the Nintendo can't run that completely falls apart. games take so long to come out now that by the time they release, the new Nintendo console is out and it's more powerful and it can run everything. We are in a situation where we very likely may see the last big AAA game ever, from the old days, Grand Theft Auto 6. We very well may see a day and date release on Nintendo Switch 2. People are in denial about this. They're coping and seething about it. But without GTA, there is no driving incentive for like consumers to go for PlayStation and Xbox over Nintendo. I am not exaggerating when I say the third parties are the only reason that anybody preferred these platforms over Nintendo. The illusion that the cooler, more mature, more sophisticated games were on PlayStation and Xbox is pretty much the only defining thing about them. That over the past decade, actually past 20 years, has been slowly eroded. When you look at what Nintendo has been doing, funding projects like Eternal Darkness and Fatal Frame 4, buying Bayonetta, producing titles like Xenoblade and Fire Emblem that are geared towards older audiences. Like the idea that like PlayStation and Xbox are more mature has completely been choked out. And now, games that these third-party games that release on Nintendo hardware, like they find success even when a lot of people weren't anticipating any. Hitman World of Assassination did do fairly well on the console. Street Fighter 6 did do fairly well on the console. Final Fantasy 7 remake I think is going to do fairly well on the console. It doesn't matter that these games were years old because a lot of people in the audience did not play them on all the other platforms that they came out on because I was too busy playing better games on my piece of hardware. And that's kind of the issue now, is that there are so many games out on Switch 2 already that it is pretty much impossible ever for there to be a game drought or any kind of like incentive to go for the big new AAA game instead. Like even if I do buy a AAA game, like if I buy something sloppish like Chronos the New Dawn, like by next week I'm gonna go right back to like Nintendo games. I'm gonna go right back to like Tales of Symphonia or like Donkey Kong Bonanza or whatever, Animal Crossing New Horizons I've been playing a lot lately. Like, Nintendo games are just so much better than the competition and there's so many of them that like it's pretty much impossible to gaslight someone into thinking that there's nothing for them on Nintendo platforms. Cause that's kind of the thing I've been noticing lately is that people keep doing that thing where they're like, oh, well, I only care about 3D Mario. I only care about the new 3D Mario. That's all I want to play. I don't care about all this other stuff. I just want 3D Mario. And like, they're just getting laughed at in the community. Like back in the 90s, that kind of nonsense used to work. People used to laugh at Banjo-Kazooie. They used to laugh at Paper Mario. They used to laugh at like Luigi's Mansion and Sunshine and all that. And like these days, those games are beloved classics that are still played. Like it is in this day and age, it is pretty much impossible to downplay Nintendo titles the way you used to. We're gonna see like Kirby Air Riders like vastly outperform anyone's expectations, and that's something that I think the industry isn't really prepared for. That Nintendo could bring back a sequel to a GameCube game that was not that popular, that was not that well received, that was hugely controversial, and make it a huge cultural phenomenon. Like this kind of thing is becoming more and more common with each generation. And it is because people are playing older games, they're experiencing Nintendo titles, and it is becoming increasingly difficult for some game journal or a YouTuber to sit there and just say over and over again, I don't care about this, I don't want to play this, I don't want to see it, it's a waste of my time. Like these people, more and more, are making themselves look like complete frauds. Because so many of these games have an audience, so many of these games are hype, so many games are like taking off. Like, just look at Fire Emblem. Like how many times over the past 10 years have we seen like Nintendo YouTubers like reject RPGs, reject anime stuff, reject Fire Emblem in general, and yet like Fortune's Weave looks like it's going to be the major release that kind of tips Switch 2 over the edge, where like the plebs are gonna have to like bow their heads and acknowledge that Switch 2 is successful. Like it is a very interesting situation we're in right now. Seeing people like to kind of deny reality. everybody loved to say Nintendo failed during the Wii U generation, but what actually happened was that third parties did everything in their power to sabotage the console before it released, with late ports, with just no new games, with just every step they took was like very calculated and very deliberate to try and drive Nintendo out of the console space. Nintendo's real mistake that generation was taking EA seriously. Like, oh, we're going to have an unprecedented partnership. And yeah, no support at all. And look what happened. Nintendo's thriving and EA just sold themselves to Saudi Arabia. Like, who really lost in that situation, really? Nintendo's bigger than ever, after years of high quality Wii U titles and releases that ushered in a new age of fans versus EA that just purchased all these companies, did nothing to that with them, and ran themselves into the ground through the actions of John Riccitiello and his successors. It's like nobody thought EA was going to collapse the way they did, other than a handful of hardcore fans of the industry, myself included. Like, nobody thought that EA was going to become irrelevant, and yet seemingly out of nowhere, they did. And a big part of that is because they did everything in their power not to work with the market leader. This is the reality of the situation we're seeing with the major third parties, is that all the traditional major third parties, the ones that threw their weight behind PlayStation, Square, Konami, Capcom, Sega, EA, Ubisoft, all these major PlayStation subsidiary studios, all of them are basically obsolete in 2025 as the industry moves more towards a smaller budget, lower, smaller individual teams that are producing smaller projects that can be released on Nintendo platforms. Chronos the New Dawn, I hated the game, but it had a certain success on Nintendo Switch 2. Silent Hill 2 remake is getting ported to Nintendo Switch 2. We've seen like Street Fighter 6 become successful. We've seen like, uh, you know, these, Silk Song is very successful on Switch 2. We have seen this over and over and over again, where like companies tried to sabotage Nintendo. They tried to not release these games and to try to keep people from talking about them or caring about them at all. And yet in the end, the entire situation just kind of like imploded. Like, that's what we've been seeing, is that these companies are just nowhere near the level of influential and power that they used to have. Final Fantasy, it used to be a meme among the community that like, well, actually, Final Fantasy is way more successful than Zelda. Well, okay, but which one is going to get a successful film adaptation? Which one still gets relevant game releases? Like, all of the memes and the narratives that people have introduced over the years, this idea that Ultima influenced Zelda, to like the idea that Zelda fell off with Breath of the Wild, like, none of this is going to stand the test of time or remain relevant. Like, that's kind of where we're at now. Like, we're at the point now where we can look back and see that the Nintendo games that came out in 2001 or whatever, the ones that were written off and ignored compared to Devil May Cry or Ace Combat 4 or Silent Hill 2 or whatever, are actually way better than the games that they were competing with. Like, the GameCube is undoubtedly far more well remembered than the PS2, because GameCube owners actually played their games. The PS2 was and always has been essentially a DVD player. I've seen people's PS2's libraries, and it was pitiful seeing like rows and rows of sports games, of seeing like maybe Crash Bandicoot 4 lumped in there, maybe like some like slop it was weird, looking back in that period and seeing just how like the PS2 lineup compared to the GameCubes. Like, it is shocking just how much better the GameCube actually was than the PS2 in hindsight. And that feeling I think extends throughout into the Switch 2 generation, because people keep trying to do this thing where they're sitting there saying the Switch 2 has no games, nothing's selling on it, it's not successful, and yet in reality, Air Riders is going to do huge numbers, ZA is going to do huge numbers, Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave is going to do huge numbers. Like, they are in complete denial about the reality of their situation, is that nothing has changed. There isn't going to be some huge drop off point where people just suddenly start magically hating Nintendo. The people who hate Nintendo now are just people who have been doing it for 30 years because the third parties told them to. Like, they are just still dancing to like 30-year-old Sega slogans, essentially. Like, does what Nintendo don't is kind of their rallying cry. Like, they hate Nintendo more than they love their own brands. And I think that extends to EA as well. At any point, they could have come out and they could have like righted the ship. They could have worked with Nintendo. They could have put sports games on their platforms. They could have done anything to save themselves. But instead, they put themselves in this precarious position, and there's just absolutely nothing that anyone can do to stop it.